Well, one thing that I believe is that the West in general, they've lost their soft power capabilities, and the United States and Israel and the Israeli regime and the British regime, they're all very similar in that respect. When you look at, for example, Russia, it doesn't matter if you're reading The Guardian or Fox News. The narrative on Russia is the same. One may be more subtle and more sophisticated, and the other may be more bombastic. The same is true with Iran. Those who hate Trump, when it comes to bombing Iran, they 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 support it. They support the narrative. Iran is evil. Uh, During the riots, we now know that this was a conspiracy from day one. As you pointed out, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury said we brought down the currency to bring people to the streets. And then what happened 2 days after we had mild protests about the currency, with no arrests and no intimidation, and the government saying you're right and we have to sort this out. Then we had this influx of very violent rioters and armed terrorists. And they, on the 9th and 8th of January, slaughtered police officers, murdered innocent people. Yet the collective media, from The Guardian to Fox News, Breitbart and The Independent, The Times of London and the BBC and the New York Times, all of them have the same narrative, that these are just peaceful protesters being gunned down, even though Pompeo said in his tweet that Mossad's on the ground, even the former head of the CIA, even though Pompeo on Channel 13 of Israel said the U.S. was supporting these rioters, even though Channel 14 of Israel, which is close to Netanyahu, was saying that foreign governments, meaning Israel and probably the United States, brought in the weapons to murder hundreds, as they said, of police officers and security agents. And even though we have the statement by Mossad in Persian saying that we're on the ground in Iran. And of course, more recently, we have heard that they brought in 6,000 starlings. For what exactly? For who? So obviously, they had people on the ground, and Trump was saying, take the buildings, take the cities, take. So these starlings were basically to coordinate these terrorist elements. So the footage is there, the evidence is there, the admissions are there, the boasting is there. But Western media, whether pro Trump or anti Trump, all have the same fake narrative. These are peaceful protesters, and the government is gunning them down. They went up to 80,000 deaths. And then when the Iranian government gave all the names of everyone who was killed, whether police officers or innocent bystanders or the rioters, there was 3,117, and then those fake numbers went down to 6,000. Well, they couldn't accept the Iranian numbers, so they had to say 6,000 or some other number. But the point is that all this Western media, which was saying 10, 20, 30, 50, they said there's no internet, but they were inflating the numbers. They were the ones who were responsible. Their own governments were responsible by admission for what happened, yet they inflate the numbers to and blame Iran because they wanted to create an environment for war. Was what it was all about. What they wanted to do was to create chaos in Iran, say that the Iranian government is evil, is gunning down women and children. Uh, the Epstein class media, they really care about women and children, obviously. And then that would give a justification for Trump to strike. And Trump was on the verge of striking Iran. And according to what we're hearing, and I don't know if it's true, Netanyahu at that time, being fearful of the implications for the regime and the Iranian missiles raining down on the regime, he asked for Trump not to attack at that moment. Again, I don't know if it's true. This is the what we are hearing from Western sources. So um, while there is no clear narrative, but it is interesting how, I mean, it's difficult to understand what's going on behind the scenes in the United States, but it is interesting how Western media is so monolithic in certain ways, and it reminds me of about uh, Venezuela when before the war you saw these. The so-called left, and they're not left, but uh, the mainstream left in the West and the so-called liberals in the West. Some of them were calling for strikes and an attack on Venezuela. And some were saying, no, no, the regime, as they like to, that whenever someone says regime, you should be suspicious of that person. When they talk about the Venezuelan regime or the Iranian regime or whatever, when as soon as a Westerner talks about regimes, you have to be suspicious about that person. But anyway, not everyone, but because a lot of people are just used to using the term. But in the media, you have to be suspicious. So, the Venezuelan regime is evil. Maduro is evil, but we shouldn't attack. These people are just as guilty for war crimes as the Zionists and neocons who support war because they are sort of attempting to legitimize war, legitimize death and destruction. Instead of being courageous and saying, no, Venezuela is none of your business. The president of Venezuela is none of your business. You are the criminals for murdering Venezuelans and fishermen and ordinary people in the country and carrying out aggression. Instead of saying that, they say, yes, they are evil, but let's not do it. Right now, as you and I are speaking, Glenn, the United States has imposed a siege on Cuba, starving 10 million people. So these journalists in the Guardian or the Independent or the New York Times or these none of them are screaming bloody murder and saying that this is outrageous that they're starving women and children in Cuba. No, it's all they'll focus on Iran as much as possible. They'll criticize the US government, but they'll never use the language that they use about Iran or Venezuela about their own regimes.
Yeah, no, this is the political version of why do you hit yourself, bully? That is, they spent these decades now choking the Venezuelan economy, and then of course they refer to the mismanagement of the government, why the country is poor, and why we will actually help now to bring. Well, that's the language. We're going to help to the Venezuelans. Finally, now they can have prosperity, and of course the same with Cuba. You see this rhetoric coming up as well. They just implemented this oil embargo to suffocate the population there, which affects everything, even the hospitals. And then, of course, well, we owe it to the Cubans to help them to, have a more dignified, better lives. It's just very strange to watch. Maybe just the credibility disappears. I mean, only today there's an article in Politico which sees a bit of a contradiction. That is, the different Western governments have been hyping the threats. Everyone's coming to take us, to get us. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, everything's a threat. World War III is coming, and then in Politico they report that the polling shows that even though everyone now is afraid of World War III and threat is up through the roof, they still don't give their leaders the license to cut out of their welfare to spend on the military. So it's usually when you inflate engage in threat inflation, what you cash in on is more money for the military, but it doesn't appear that it's working as efficiently within these countries, which are polled. I can't remember who was, Germany, France, UK, yeah, the usual. Um, no, so it is it is quite something's wrong, because in the past these kind of the narratives, they had very clear, predictable outcome in terms of what it would legitimize. But now, yeah, there's no cohesion in the narrative, and they're not achieving what they're supposed to. So yes, probably good news for Iran.
The fact that so many Europeans, including in your country, are implicated in the Epstein files. And again, we know very little. Most of the files are not going to be released, and the files that have been released are largely redacted. The most sensitive parts are redacted. And yet, despite that, you see that the foundations of of Western politics are shaking in certain countries, in the UK, without a doubt, in the United States. So when the political elites can no longer have the trust of the population, 4 years ago, maybe people would have believed them, but now people are far more skeptical and cynical about their intentions. And that's why I think that as we move forward, it's going to be more difficult for the likes of Trump and Netanyahu and the Epstein class and for to deceive the public because life is becoming increasingly difficult for people across the world and the West in particular for the sake of our own discussion. And people's eyes are more they're more impoverished, their eyes are more open, and I don't think that's a good indication for the elites in the West to be able to push their agenda much further.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of the tricks of the past don't work anymore. I remember back in 2016 when there was such a disgruntlement with the American politicians that they voted in Trump. The first response was, well, let's blame the Russians. So Trump was an agent of the Kremlin. I mean, it was very ludicrous and it didn't make any sense. But they went with it, and most people believed that there was something there. And then, of course, in 2020, you had the Biden laptop scandal. And then they went with, how can they explain this? And they went with the Russia thing as well. It never made any sense. I
And
mean,
remember,
you,
Glenn,
you could
one
track where it
reason
went.
why they went yeah, exactly, but one reason why they began to blame Russia was actually because of WikiLeaks and the fact that WikiLeaks had discovered a lot of corruption uh, in the political system. And instead of dealing with the evidence that WikiLeaks had discovered and Julian Assange exposed to the world, they tried to distract public attention away from that and blame Russia for the leaks instead of dealing with the leaks and the reality of the leaks. And it's apparently the young man who took that evidence. Uh, he was murdered in Washington, and so they didn't want that scandal to be blamed on the United States or on the intelligence agencies or on Zionists or on the Epstein class. So they went and tried to blame Russia. Now, and back then it worked to a large degree. But now, after this whole, with this Epstein affair, again, they're trying to blame Russia, but it's not working anymore. So in 2016, blaming Russia had far more effect. Not that I'm not saying everyone believed it, but many did, even though it was fake back then. But now they're trying again to say that Epstein was a Russian spy, but no one's buying it. That's why I think that things have changed dramatically.